Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Philosophy Uncorked podcast, where the goal is always to kind of open the champagne of the soul and have a great conversation. And today I have a new co-host who's joining in and an incredible philosopher. I'll introduce them both right now. So my new co-host for today is Lucie Weberman, who's a student at King's College, Cambridge University, an undergraduate student in philosophy. And she writes exhilarating articles that really examine the underexplored elements of the universal human experience from really chilling and amazing perspectives. So she's an aspiring writer, and I think she's got a great future there. And she's got great questions that she has for John Cottingham prepared today. And we also have our guest today, who is none other than Professor John Cottingham, who is a professor at Reading University and a fellow associated with Oxford University, and one of the greatest philosophers of religion alive today. And it's a great honor to be interviewing you today. So I wanted to open up with, you kind of are articulating a vision to include like pretty much more or all the resources we can of the human psyche and intellectual engagement into philosophy to enrich the way that we solve problems and the way that we address and approach various issues. And I wanted to first applaud that by noting that I like this from Dan Dennett, actually, who once said that philosophy is what you do when you don't know what to do. It operates in the gray zone. So it always seems to me that disqualifying certain approaches invariably reduces the chances that we're going to find a sort of way of approaching something that's completely satisfying, because we don't know what to do always with the big questions sometimes. And so with that being noted, I wanted to ask you, Professor Cottingham, what was your personal journey into philosophy? What brought you to a life of the mind?
Yes, that's well, I guess at school, sort of 16, 17, 18, like many people of that age, I was very excited by grand questions about the meaning of life, and in particular, the way the existentialists tackled that. I remember reading a lot of Nietzsche, some of Camus. There was a British writer called Colin Wilson who wrote a book called The Outsider, which I don't know if it's much read now, but it was kind of derivative from Camus, L'Étranger, and so on. But it did very much appeal to the philosophical inquirer who was really new to the subject. I also remember being, and still am, very drawn by T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, which of course is a philosophical work as well as one of the great literary works of the 20th century, and expresses truths about human alienation, I think, that can't really be expressed except through the medium of poetry. So I guess my initial induction had quite a strong literary and existential, in the broad sense, flavor. When I went to Oxford, I was channeled into classical philosophy. We had to read in those days the whole of Plato's Republic and the whole of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in the original Greek. So it was a lot of hard work, and as indeed was a lot of the classics we did. I was trained in the classical tradition, writing a lot of Latin and Greek prose and verse and so on. But as far as the modern philosophy I encountered as an undergraduate, to be honest, I found that in those days really quite dreary, very dry, concerned with minute questions of linguistic analysis. In fact, the phrase linguistic philosophy was often used in those days. And it really wasn't until I became a graduate student and started working on Descartes that I started to have a sense that yes, this subject is one which actually connects with my early interests in the meaning of life in a grand synoptic perspective, which takes in language, of course, but also science, ethics, metaphysics, and indeed theology. So that's a broad sketch of the sort of starting points.
Yeah, and that plays wonderfully into some of what you wrote in the humane perspective as well, when you talked about the kind of risk of subspecialization, that philosophy is becoming so divided into specialties where people are trying to work as if there's no interconnectedness between the different areas of philosophy, is something that might kind of impoverish the field a little bit. And so, I think I'm going to pass it over to Lucie, who has a great question for you. Something that was inspired actually from her own reading of Descartes versus what a lot of contemporary philosophy is like. And I'll let her ask.
Yeah, so it stuck out to me that you were a Descartes specialist, because when I was reading your book, I was interested in what you said about the style in which philosophy is written these days, and the sort of unimaginative, very dry kind of style that these philosophy essays are written in. And it brought my mind back to Descartes, because I think that Descartes understood kind of what you're talking about. Of he understood that there's a cognitive value in the reader sort of coming to their own conclusions while reading. So I guess my question is, do you think that Descartes is in any way a humane philosopher?
Right. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think, well, first of all, the point you referred to towards the end, Descartes says at one point, I'm not interested in people, in the reader, except for those who are prepared to follow me on the path of meditation and make it their own, which I think implies that he sees philosophy not just as a kind of blackboard subject or whiteboard subject where you write some propositions and discuss them, but actually as the name of his most famous work implies, a set of meditations where you have to go deep into awareness of yourself and the search for God in his case, and then on to the so-called external world. He's very much following in the footsteps of St. Augustine, in that, as many scholars have pointed out, in that inner descent. The style, I think, is important. The style of Descartes' Discours de la Méthode, his first work, which he published anonymously, is, I think, thought to be very important for the development of French letters. And his style in the Meditations, which is kind of beautiful classical Latin, has a gem-like quality, an absolute precision and clarity, which is very important. Now, style is often opposed to content, and I think it's sometimes thought that philosophy should ignore style and just go for the bare bones of the argument. What's your argument? Is often in seminars and things. And the modern style of PowerPoint presentations, I think, boosts that. You just put up the stuff, and as if what you're actually saying is just a minor commentary on the bare bones of the argument, which carry all the weight. That's a very left brain approach, as if philosophy works by keeping cautiously back, standing back, controlling, and just evaluating the argument. But I think what actually drives the engine is something much richer, much fuller. You mentioned Christophe, you mentioned Dennett earlier. He is clearly a genius, a brilliant philosopher, and he's a great stylist. But actually, in his approach to the subject, I think he's very left brain. But that's for another debate. And so there's a mixture there of qualities, many of which I admire, but some of which I'm a bit wary of. But sorry, Lucie, does that address your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm finding this at Cambridge at the moment. I mean, I'm in a very analytical department, and my supervisor when advising me how to write essays, he says philosophers would make terrible murder mystery writers because they tell you exactly what they're going to say and how they're going to say it right through to the end. So I think, no, that makes a lot of sense and definitely answers the question.
And there was a link, or sorry.
No, I mean, certainly the requirements of essays and dissertations are such that you have to say, I'm going to do X, then Y, and then you do it, and then you conclude. And of course, signposting is very important. But I think it's often more interesting if people say, yes, I'm going to do X and Y, but here's why I'm going to do it. In other words, you share some initial insights which bring the subject to life, which show it's not just an exercise for the sake of it, but it connects with some more personal or spiritual or psychological issues that bring it to life.
Yeah, and that's something that I think that plays well on a link that you kind of developed in your initial response as well between, like you mentioned the Descartes and kind of inspired by St. Augustine using the inner journey. And that inner journey obviously has transformative potential to it. And so I'm kind of wondering, from your perspective, when you think of philosophy and style, which you've linked with the inner journey a little bit, do you think that there's something missing when philosophers don't experience a transformation, or if they don't write things that can help people experience a transformation in terms of perspective or in terms of their life direction or something like that? Is that problematic for you?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. In one way, I want to say that's fine. You let 1,000 flowers blossom. So, for example, in my way of doing philosophy of religion, does not rule out someone taking a very detached, dry, analytic approach if they wish to. But I do think that, particularly with subjects like philosophy of religion and philosophy of moral philosophy, that they do both have a personal dimension, and that it's important to connect one's inquiries, one's philosophical analysis and discussion with the life, the moral life or the religious life. So sometimes when I hear my colleagues in ethics, meta-ethics has become incredibly specialized, and on they go about reasons for action, reasons internalism, motives internalism, motives externalism. All these distinctions proliferate. But one sometimes wonders, how does this actually connect with the way we respond to a moral dilemma, or the way, even when there's no dilemma, we feel what's now called a normative pull towards a certain course of action. In other words, we feel that moral values have a certain authority which commands our attention and our allegiance, even when so often we turn away and pursue our selfish desires instead. So that to me is such an important part of the subject matter of morality that I feel it's a pity if it remains just purely at the meta level.
That pulling of this kind of normative force that you talk about, I noticed in Search of the Soul, and again in the humane perspective, you do reference Iris Murdoch a little bit, and I'm wondering if she's an influence on this role of the normative pull in terms of setting up a kind of theory of the good that kind of compels us towards it, and we strive to, though we don't ultimately achieve it, we strive towards it. And I'm wondering if that is a way that you look at this world as well, or...
Yeah, Murdoch's interesting. I used to read her novels avidly as a graduate. As a philosopher, she didn't exert much influence in those days, I think. But interestingly now, she's come back into prominence. In particular, that book, Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals. Because again, a lot of contemporary meta-ethics is sort of metaphysics light. People try to talk about reasons for action and motives without anything underpinning normativity. Reasons count for or against an action, and that's supposed to be enough in a way. They have a life of their own. But with Murdoch, you have, as you suggested, you have something quite powerfully metaphysical. You have a sort of Platonist idea, I suppose, of the good, which draws us, which transforms us, which we respond to. It's interesting that a lot of the ways she talks about the good are quite similar to the way theists talk about God. Mm-hmm. In fact, she says at one point in that book, the good is the reality of which God is the dream. Mm-hmm. I mean, why the Platonic form of the good is sort of something she's prepared to accept, while the religious version, God as goodness itself, as Aquinas says, does not attract her, is an interesting question, maybe partly explained by the climate in which she operated.
Yeah, and that's, and by the way, Lucie, feel free to jump in if you have anything that you want to share, any questions, but I'm just going to keep asking some questions if that's okay. I was just thinking, you had mentioned earlier that there's this kind of risk of trying to break things down and give them all their own terminologies and kind of their component parts and all of this. And you mentioned this with Descartes talking about slipping into verbiage where you just start to name things and the proliferation of names and titles, but it ends up being circular in the end because it doesn't actually get you deep down into the concepts that are at stake in philosophy in the same way that it could in biochemistry or another field. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit and explain how it relates to, if it's okay with you, but how it relates to, I think you use human in a kind of normative sense, like to be human, to be whole and full, is a kind of normative ideal too. And I'm wondering if you could explain the relation between avoiding this trap of verbiage and philosophy that enables us to be kind of human in a normative sense of the term.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are lots of interesting questions packed into that. This term, in the book, the term humane, which I use, the humane perspective, perhaps not ideal because it's in many European languages that, or at least certainly when one gives talks about it, people often don't, if English is not their first language, they don't hear it correct. They think it's just human. And some of my work's been translated into Greek at the moment, and they're having a real problem with humane, how to translate it. I partly chose it because of the connection with the humanities and the idea that philosophy is trying to ape science too much, whereas in fact, I think ideally it should occupy a kind of middle ground between science and literature, the arts, and so on. It needs to draw on both those parts of our culture. So it needs to be humanistic, connecting up with Bernard Williams' idea of philosophy as a humanistic discipline. Being human in the normative sense is complex. Descartes, perhaps we could just go back to Descartes there. Of course, as you know, when he asks, "What am I?" he replies, "I am a thinking thing." And he goes from there to suggesting that we are basically an incorporeal, immaterial spirit. That's the conclusion philosophical analysis leads him to. But actually, in another way, if you ask him, "What are you?" he would reply, "I'm a human being." And a human being is a creature with feelings, passions, emotions, an embodied being of flesh and blood. And in his correspondence with Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, he says, well, we understand, I'm paraphrasing now, but in a way that I think meets your question. To understand what it is to be human, we need experience. We need embodied experience of our feelings, what we would now perhaps talk about as the phenomenology of experience, daily experience. Whereas to work out our essence as a thinking substance, we just work with the intellect. Bringing those two together is not easy. But of course, in Christian theology, incarnation is very important. So it's important that becoming what we are meant to be is not a matter of trying to model ourselves on angels or disembodied spirits. It's a matter of somehow redeeming our fallen humanity. And those theological insights seem to me to capture something important about the human condition, which even which a secularist or a non-believer can still appreciate. I certainly don't want to say there's a sort of private club of the believers who do their own philosophy. I think that would just be further ghettoization to the compartmentalization that's going on already in the subject.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Lucie?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask more specifically, how does humane philosophy feature in your methodology when you sit down to write a book or think about something? Yeah.
Yeah. It's actually very difficult to describe the creative process. I mean, I wouldn't presume to compare myself with a great creative artist, a novelist, or a poet, but there is something creative about philosophy, I think. And what one's often taught at school, do an essay plan, list the points you're going to make, and then make them. Probably very good advice for a 3-hour exam, but not, I think, for the chapter of a book. It just somehow grows organically. And part of the reason I like to refer to poems or quotations from literature or other sources of a humane kind is that I think these often operate on us subliminally, below the threshold of conscious awareness, and somehow serve to generate insights or trigger insights and responses in the reader. And so this is, I think, part of the philosophical process. Plato, as you know, often uses images and literary figures and metaphors. And I think these are not just illustrations or peripheral things. They are part and parcel of the philosophical process. Again, I want to resist philosophy, which has the PowerPoint list of propositions, and then anything else, like a poem, is just an illustration, which is already somehow downgrading it from a role, imaginative role. So I think the direct answer to your question is one tries to employ the imagination as well as the analytic intellect. But it's not easy to give a formula for that. In fact, I think if one tried to do it by numbers, maybe it wouldn't work. I haven't written much about this, but I think probably there's a two-step process. The first is to go with the flow, and then the next morning when you look at what you've written and have to get to work on it with reason and the quality control department, which is rational analysis and critical distance. But I think both are needed.
Do you ever give yourself time when you're trying to conceive of a new chapter for a book or something, or you're writing an article? This is a very much from personal inspiration that I'm curious about this, but do you ever give yourself time that like downloading time where you've read, you've set your attention on a sequence of ideas or thoughts or questions, and then you just do something else and you let it kind of subconsciously process a little bit so that it comes back to you in fuller form later? Is that something that you do yourself, or am I still kind of...
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, everyone's different in that way. The poet A.E. Housman, I don't know if either of you read Housman, but the Shropshire lad, great sort of beautifully phrased lyric poetry, I suppose you'd call it. But he was once asked, how do you set about writing a poem? And he and his rather stiff, sort of buttoned up Englishman of his time said, well, I have a sandwich for lunch and half a pint of beer, and then I go for a brisk walk. In a way, that's the right answer. You know, there is no formula for stimulating the imagination. But while you're doing the brisk walk, I think all the things you mentioned are probably happening below the threshold.
Yeah, which, you know, in Search of the Soul, you beautifully used Malebranche to talk about the ways that we're dark to ourselves. You know, that, you know, you look inward and only find darkness. And this seemed to be really important to the humane perspective and approach, that we have to be aware of the fact that we're kind of faulty at immediate, transparent introspection that gives us the ready answers to why we're thinking what we're thinking. And so there's this side of the darkness that's within us. What is your basic response to that, and what role do you think philosophy can play in reducing that darkness, especially if it incorporates the methods of the psychoanalytic tradition and stuff?
Yeah, that's a big question, interesting one. I'm not sure exactly what Malebranche meant by "Je ne suis que ténèbres à moi-même." I am darkness to myself. But I think he was although he's a sort of very much a disciple of Descartes, I think he was partly casting doubt on this sometimes rather smug Cartesian idea of clear and distinct ideas. As if, you know, here's the physics, mathematical physics, here's the thinking substance, and I can give you these philosophical account of both. But actually, when we introspect, it's far from clear what we discover. David Hume thought he discovered nothing, just a succeeding flux of perceptions or impressions. No self. And I don't think it's possible to provide a secure philosophical proof that the nature of the self is such and such. But I think it's obvious particularly from the moral life, that we often have, this is Freud, of course, and his successors, we often have very imperfect grasp of what is really motivating us. Sometimes we pursue something which has a great glamour or allure, but that may be because of projections, sometimes from childhood, of which we're only partly aware. And it's very difficult to achieve self-awareness. And it's even harder, of course, to achieve self-purification. This is where, again, I think the theological tradition is right. There is a fallen element to our humanity. I mean, that's perhaps a metaphor, but we are clearly a flawed, confused species who often make terrible mistakes in our pursuit of what we think is the good, and only discover when it's too late that we were pursuing a false path. And those sorts of confusions, of course, often make personal relationships very difficult. It takes a long time to get to know someone and a long time to get to know oneself. I think philosophy should be sensitive to that, and not to treat the mind as if it was a transparent goldfish bowl where things called beliefs and desires just float around. And we just have to say, well, I desire X and I perceive that Y is a means to X, therefore I choose Y. That's an abstraction, and very few choices in life are as simple as that.
Yeah, and it's very interesting too when you think about, it seems like this could apply on two different levels, right? Because on one level, there's the benefit of exploring how dark our own motives can be to us for the sake of having a more complete image of the human experience. But also there's the other level of, and I don't mean to speak poorly of philosophy, but as somebody who stayed with graduate school and everything, and speaking with somebody like yourself and with Lucie, who's at her stage in philosophy as well, and it does seem like at every stage of philosophy that at least I've encountered so far, there's a bit of a prestige economy. There's a bit of a, for graduate students, who's going to what school and, who worked with whom and whatnot. And there's this very competitive prestige economy, which would seem to be something that adds fuel to the fire of conforming more regularly to this kind of scientizing philosophy, as people are really looking to make a specific name for themselves in a specific subset of the field. And, I think that this ability to generate roles is something that might be an undiscussed appeal of the kind of scientizing of philosophy, is that you feel like you can go to a very narrow element of it and do something meaningful. Whereas the big picture philosophers, like you mentioned, of Descartes and Kant and so many others, it would seem to make it more competitive. It would seem like there's only so many slots open for philosophizing at that level of worldview, right?
Yeah. I think that's true. I think the way the profession operates does, and has for some time, favored intense specialization. after all, if you go into a very narrow subfield, the objections to reason's internalism, let's say, and you really work at the literature and the articles for the last 2 years, the objections, the reply, and completely master that, you're probably going to produce a thesis which either no one's going to have the patience to wade through sufficiently to find any flaws in it. Whereas if you advance a grand general view about the meaning of life or human nature, it's going to be quite easy for the examiner to pick out, to challenge it. So I think there is a bias in favor of playing safe. But maybe one can, and I think there's a lot to be said for intensive study, actually. I don't want to put it all on one side. Intensive study allows you to get to know an author really well, or a subject or a sub area really well, and to achieve a certain depth. But I do think it should be possible to keep one's eye on the horizon as well, even while going into the detail. I see Lucie's nodding. Does that strike you as plausible in relation to the course you're doing now? And so on?
Yeah. I'm at the moment I'm doing the analysis of knowledge, and we're going over the whole JTB Gettier cases. And no, it's really striking to me how for years and years and years you have various philosophers coming up with the latest state-of-the-art JTB plus X clause, and you kind of they lose sight of what knowledge is really about. And so yeah, I see that.
Yes, yeah, I mean, being able to play the moves in the game does become a sort of end in itself. And at the end of the day, well, I perhaps shouldn't say anything subversive, but I'm not convinced that all the frantic articles published in the last 10 years have really added that much to Plato's account of knowledge. But of course, if you can change the direction of the debate, as some of these Gettier arguments have done, then at least for a time, you're going to occupy the limelight. So I think there is an ego, as I think Christophe was suggesting, there is an ego element in the way. I don't think philosophy is any worse than any other academic subject. And in any subject, there are sort of superstars and acolytes and ambitious young Turks and all the rest of it. But perhaps philosophy does, however, have a presumption that one ought to be conducting it with integrity. That there's this French philosopher, Pierre Hadot, the Jesuit, I think, who talked about philosophy as a way of life, going back to the older conception of philosophizing, which you find in Socrates and the classical writers. It's very much a moral enterprise. It's not a purely academic, as we now say, exercise. It's to do with self-discovery and scientific discovery and intellectual discovery. And it affects the trajectory of one's life. So it's not just a 9-to-5 business.
Yeah, and you mentioned Pierre Hadot, and I hope I'm not twisting things in the wrong direction, but I think that if I recall correctly, philosophy schools were kind of, it's almost like a religious experience to be in a philosophy school, insofar as you were being guided on how to live, and you're being guided on why to live that way. And so there's a lot of depth to the experience. And ever since philosophy has kind of split up into so many specializations and so many sub departments and so forth and so on, it does seem like there's no belonging as part of the experience of being a philosopher. Like it no longer feels like, being a philosopher gives you a belonging to a community and a way of life that you understand the why for. And, and I'm wondering if you think that is a kind of good or a bad thing, in the sense that, is philosophy done better without a sense of belonging, or is it done better when that's a part of the experience, in your opinion?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think of course, it is a communal enterprise. You need to, it's a dialectical subject, and always has been, right, since Socrates. So you do, in a way, need a community. And actually, one of the fruitful things that happened during the pandemic was that a few of us created a reading group on Zoom, and that sort of kept us going. But it still survived now, because that a monthly meeting with a group of like-minded people can be immensely fruitful. They're working on the same area. There's belonging, but there's also longing, I think, the longing of the human spirit to reach, well, the longing for transcendence would be a portentous way of putting it. And I think that element, actually, going back to, Lucie was referring to Descartes, going back to Descartes, his proofs of God are not just blackboard intellectual exercises for the sake of it, nor are they even just a sort of propedeutic to science. In the third meditation in particular, there's a journey, as the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas points out in his analysis of Descartes. It's a kind of encounter. It's the encounter of the finite mind with something beyond its grasp, reaching forward to the infinite. And so, although it's expressed as a philosophical argument, with premises and conclusion, if you actually follow the path of the meditator becomes aware of their existence, and then of their imperfection, and then in realizing their weakness, their lack of knowledge and power, they immediately, implicitly are aware of something greater towards which they reach. To use a metaphor Descartes used at one time, God, the infinite, is like a mountain which I can't comprehend. I can't put my arms around it, but I can reach towards it. And that sort of dynamic journey aspect of Descartes is very important, I think. And in a way, I think a lot of philosophy is like that. One is reaching forward to something not yet fully encompassed, but of which one has dim intimations. And trying to articulate that quest is part of what philosophy is about, I think.
So, Lucie, do you have any questions, Lucie?
Yeah, I do. I'd like to go back to something you've mentioned a couple of times and at the start, which is your love of literature. And I wanted to ask what you would say to someone who's reading a work and is thinking, yes, I agree that there's a dimension to being ethical or religion that's not going to be found in dry analytic philosophy, but that's being covered by other disciplines or by the arts. We can find a tremendous amount of information about these things through literature. Why do we need philosophy to do it? Is there something which you think philosophy does well that these other disciplines still can't quite do?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I sometimes think, yes, someone could pursue literary studies and maybe get as many insights from that as one would by doing philosophical studies. But in a way, I think it's a pity that the two are separated into specialized departments. I think philosophy does have something unique. It aims at seeing how the pieces fit together. So you might get, say, some moral insights from reading George Eliot, The Mill on the Floss, let's say, and immersing yourself in that novel might enrich your perceptions. But if you take a philosophical perspective on it, you're also trying to see how those insights relate to other parts of your conceptual scheme. For example, how does moral insight fit into scientific insight? Is there any connection, or are they two completely different things? And how does that fit in with spiritual or religious insights? So it's that what I call the synoptic perspective, bringing things together, which I think philosophy is probably uniquely equipped to do. So it's a sort of combination of both what I call the epistemology of engagement, kind of immersing yourself in the material and being open and porous, but also the dimension of the epistemology of detachment, the critical quality control aspect of logic and analysis. And fusing those together is not easy, but I think philosophy is perhaps uniquely the subject which tries to do that.
So this is very interesting because you mentioned previously and again now that there's this element of reaching towards something kind of beyond our current capacities. And, you know, it in Search of the Soul and in the humane perspective a little bit, you talked about the value of the unified life quite a bit. And I wondered sort of, how do you relate the unified life with this striving forward for something that's beyond us, the desire for transcendence, or like how do the two relate?
Gosh, you ask very challenging questions, which is
Sorry.
no, this is good. I think let's use the Judeo-Christian model for the moment. In reaching forward to the transcendent, there is this sense of being confronted by something we don't fully understand, but which we know, but which we feel scrutinizes us, judges us. And there's something about that gaze, the gaze of the all-wise, compassionate other, that demands that one confront it without evasion, without deception, without posturing or simulation. In that sense, it's rather like the psychoanalytic process, the process of confronting the therapist without evasion or projections or dissimulation or simulation. So integrity, in a way, the search for integrity is a precondition for the whole enterprise to go forward. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, I think it sounds like part of the formation of the whole self, or the unified self, involves the confronting process, the striving process for that which is beyond it. as part of it seems like almost self-awareness gets captured in that to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, that's the element of the Judeo-Christian ethic and tradition, I think, which is needed to supplement the Aristotelian view, which is all very calm and rational. You know, you're inducted into the right habits of virtue as a child, and then you lead the good life. I mean, it can be weakness of will and so on, but it's a fairly rationalistic account of virtue. And I think goes back to Malebranche and the darkness of the human soul. It doesn't perhaps pay sufficient attention to the problematic nature of the human psyche. Half beast, half angel, as St. Augustine said. You know, and evolutionary theory, in a way, confirms that now for us.
Yeah.
We inherit all sorts of structures and dispositions from our distant past. But we also have developed these rational faculties which enable us to stand back from that nexus of physiology and psychology and genes and inherited propensities and just reflect. That reflective power, which no other animal on the planet has, is something that sets us apart. So the beast angel metaphor, if you think it's a metaphor, it has, I think, a deep truth which is in a way confirmed by science, not refuted by it. I very much think the religious perspective is not something which is in opposition to science. On the contrary, I think they represent in the conception of the self and the soul presented by the religious tradition is, as far as I can see, very compatible with anything we've learned from science, from evolution, or from Freud. Although, of course, Freud himself didn't buy the religious story.
Right. But he kind of has a located original sin in his own way. And so, you know, it's very interesting. There's a lot of thoughts coming to mind. I just had two quick thoughts I wanted to hear your response to. And then Lucie, if you want to go after, I don't mean to cut you off or anything. But, you know, the first thing is when you were talking about the angel and the beast, this kind of the passions and reason and all of this stuff, that we're kind of hosting the mix of the two. And it reminded me of a Khalil Gibran poem where he talks about being the host to reason and passion. And that, you know, as a good host, he tries to make sure they're not in conflict with each other. And I'm wondering if you have a kind of theory of analysis about the ways that reason and passion ought to relate to each other in a kind of, for especially philosophical activity, and maybe more broadly about life, but whatever you think that dynamic is, if you can be like Khalil Gibran suggests, a host to make sure they don't disagree.
Yeah, I don't know that passage, but it's very suggestive. Descartes once said in correspondence, if an angel were inhabiting a body, it would not feel as we do. It would simply observe intellectually, as it were, what happened to the body. So if you started sawing its leg off, it would perceive that its foot was damaged. It wouldn't feel pain in the way we know so well human being does. So we're kind of intimately involved in the body, and what philosophers call the phenomenology, the way it feels. You know, all this Thomas Nagel stuff about what it's like to taste coffee or smell a rose or feel pain. That phenomenology is, if you like, the signature of our humanity. it's a sign that we're not these disembodied intellects who happen to be inhabiting a body, but that we're an integrated biological creature, a human being. And I think that does connect with the humane agenda, because what I'm partly saying is that we need the right brain as well as the left brain, to put it in Ian McGilchrist's terms. And I know a lot of my philosophical colleagues have problems about some of his claims, but I find him extremely compelling in his diagnosis of how philosophy, and indeed our culture generally, has become too left brain, too detached, too manipulative. So we try to control things all the time rather than realizing that we're part of them.
Mm-hmm.
We try to control nature instead of realizing that we're part of it. So the human, the integrated human being, is something I think that we should strive to become, and we should not, as some analytic, not all, but some analytic philosophers, I think, would prefer it if we were angelic intellects who just happen inconveniently to be located in a body. I hope that sort of makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Lucie, did you want to come in there at all?
Yeah. Do you have any speculations for why we've sort of, it seems like we're tending towards the left brain? I mean, I know you've talked about why specifically philosophy has gotten more scientific, but yeah, why there's this general shunning of the other part of ourselves? And do you think that there's maybe some sort of desire for control that that it's our job to rein in, that we're not doing good enough of a job of at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's sometimes laid at Descartes' door, actually, because in the discourse, he talks about his new science, the new mathematical physics, which he was really inaugurating, which of course was later taken up by Newton in a more accurate form. But he talks about the new mathematical science as enabling us to become masters and possessors of nature. Maître et possesseur de la nature, which is a chilling phrase, I think, in the light of what we've now done to them. We're controlling it, but we're destroying it as well. We've forgotten that we're part of it. So I think that this is the McGilchrist view, really, that it's part of a wider, it's not just a problem with philosophy, it's part of a wider diagnosis of our culture, that we become too manipulative, too fixated on scientific mastery and control in ways which have kind of alienated us from our home. The German existentialist Martin Heidegger, talked about being exiled from home as a sort of the very essence of the philosophical predicament, is that we're far and we need to return home. And of course that's a very ancient theme, going back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve sort of screwed up and therefore exiled themselves in a way from home. Sorry, you were going to say.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me just think that I think that also religion, for all its faults, it does remind us that we are part of something else, and if we are religious, we're so keenly aware that we're part of someone else's creation, right? And so maybe in the absence of that, we kind of, our natural inclination to try and get hold of things and control things and act as if we are outside of what we are thinking about isn't reined in properly.
I very much agree. And there's this, in ethics, there's this fantasy of autonomy, reasons for action. We're in charge of them. And yet, of course, we aren't self-creating beings. We receive everything as a gift in a certain sense. And that posture of receptivity is, I think, very important. I mean, it's easy to see. An example of this is in a personal relationship. If you take a stance of control, wanting to control your own autonomy and control the other person, that's the quickest way to destroy the relationship. You have to be receptive. You have to acknowledge that there is something there which is other than you, which you can't control. So this it's not just a religious theme. I think it runs into so many areas of life. And I think it should run into philosophy too, that the posture of humility is just vital for the right kind of philosophical understanding, which doesn't aim to map everything out completely neatly, but acknowledges need to listen, need for attunement, as some of the Buddhists say.
That this is very interesting because it makes me think about a little bit two interrelated things that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. But one is that it sounds like there's a shift from looking at the periphery of thought or the outer radius of thought, like just the reflections, the abstract connections between things, and then coming back to the center, the generator of the thought in ourselves. And that there's a relation between the two. What you see on the periphery will partially depend on how well you can control the center, how well you can navigate the center, how well you know the center. Does that sound fair to part of what you're saying, is that we go back into ourselves in part? Because the other that's related to this, I just want to share really quick, is like Reinhold Niebuhr, a Christian realist, kind of big on original sin, as you know. He had this whole theory of like the way that sin can kind of transmutate itself. Like, even if you had a society in principle of monks, somebody would want to be the chief monk or the most pure monk or whatever. And these things just creep up and they keep coming back. And so if we're not self-aware of them, they could corrupt our thoughts as well. Does that sound like a fair analysis?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure I've grasped this image of the periphery and the center, exactly how it works.
Well, just like we're generating the thoughts and then we're examining them.
Yeah.
When they get to the outer edges, so to speak. That
Yeah.
might be a failed metaphor, but
no, it's interesting. I mean, of course, again, ever since Descartes, there's been a lot of emphasis on the center, the cogito, the I think, the subjective experience. But of course, a lot of understanding of life, of morality, of science, in a way, the self sort of drops out of the picture. One's focused on the phenomenon rather than oneself. And that's, we were talking about integrity earlier, integrating. And that's perhaps the hardest integration of all to achieve, fitting in subjectivity into the wider picture, the objective world. And as far as I know, no philosopher has done that yet. Dennett, who you mentioned at the beginning, sort of does it, explains consciousness, but only, I think, at the cost, ultimately, of really denying it. The phenomenological aspect sort of drops out of the picture. So that's an area in philosophy of mind, I think, which is fascinating. but which perhaps it'd be nice to return to one day, but which I haven't. I used to think a lot about it when I was working specifically on Descartes, but I'm not sure I've got anything recent to share with you on that today.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll start to kind of wind down, because I realize it's been quite a barrage of questions coming your way. So maybe if you would kind of share, I suppose, and Lucie, you can do the same if you want, but like, what would your sort of parting thought be about the role of the humane perspective in philosophy, or anything that you'd want to share with the audience?
Yeah, well, I think we've covered a lot of the aspects of it today, and thank you very much for your very helpful questions, which I think have brought into the fore just the sorts of issues I would want to emphasize. I think several themes really. One is the idea of philosophy is this synoptic perspective, which tries to bring all parts of our worldview together and see how they fit or clash. That's, I think, an essential part of it. Another crucial part is the left brain, right brain business, the idea that we, to philosophize, require all the resources of the human mind. And that includes those that depend on literary, poetic, imaginative, aesthetic, and spiritual experience, as well as the tools of logic and analysis, which are not in any way disparaging. On the contrary, I think they're an essential part of it. So that's the sort of methodology. And perhaps the third thing, I don't think all philosophy needs to do this, but I think some philosophy needs at all costs to retain it. And that is the sense of the human quest, this sense of the strange longing in the human spirit, that sense of alienation, incompleteness, hunger for completion, which I describe in terms of reaching forward to the transcendent. So those are some of the themes I think I'd want to emerge from the humane agenda, which may not be the ideal label for it, but I can't think of a better one at the moment.
Well, I'll say my thank yous. I'll let Lucie, you can say your thank yous after. Does that sound good?
Mhm.
So just, a big thank you to you, Professor Cottingham, for coming on and talking with us. I actually should say that when I was reading in preparation for this conversation, I found a lot of what you wrote very, very exciting. So there was a lot of times I had to put the book down just to go walk it out, because it's very exciting to see an image of philosophy come back to this kind of center of the conversation, where it's going to be more about, a picture that moves the soul, so to speak, a picture that an engagement with thought that can transform who we are. And I think, it's something that's really, really exciting to see that coming back in philosophy. So that's my thank you. I'm very grateful that you came on today.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking with us today. When I read it for the preparation for this, it felt refreshing to have, especially in my studies, a lot of the I think Cambridge is probably the sort of extreme end of what you're talking about. And so I've had a lot of these kind of thoughts already. And so it's just nice to see someone formulate them into a real compelling theory.
Well, thank you. And thank you both so much. I really enjoyed our discussion, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And these are sort of unending questions, really. Certainly not a set of neat answers. So I hope we'll all have the opportunity to explore them further. But thank you.
Thank you.